The English countryside in the autumn of 1943 was a sprawling, open-air arsenal. Airfields, carved from ancient farmland, were now home to the 8th Air Force's growing fleet of B-17 flying fortresses. These were not the pristine, gleaming ships of propaganda posters, they were war-weary machines, their aluminum skin stained by oil and exhaust, their interiors a labyrinth of over 30 miles of electrical wiring. It was within this hidden, chaotic web that a ghost was hiding. A flaw so subtle, so random, that it defied all logic and diagnosis. The crews called it the Gremlin. Its symptom was as terrifying as it was brief. During the critical, earth-shaking moment of takeoff, the entire electrical system of a bomber could, without warning, go completely dead. For 2, 3, sometimes 4 agonizing seconds, the cockpit would fall silent. The Euro horizon would topple, the artificial horizon would spin wildly, the radios would go mute. In an instant, the pilots were flying blind, deaf, and disoriented, their aircraft, heavy with bombs and fuel, barely clinging to the air 100 feet off the ground. Then, as suddenly as it failed, power would return. The instruments would flicker back to life, the radios would crackle, and the crew would be left with nothing but pounding hearts and a cold, lingering dread. There were no crash investigations because there were no crashes. Just near misses. The official reports were a study in frustration. Intermittent electrical failure. Cause unknown. But for the men who flew, it was a very real specter that haunted every mission's start. Into this atmosphere of superstition and bureaucratic denial, a 24-year-old technical sergeant from Kansas named Walter Wally P. Jenkins was transferred. Jenkins was not an officer. He was not a degreed engineer. He was a product of the Depression, a tinkerer who had learned his trade in his father's auto repair shop. He was assigned to a base where the Gremlin seemed particularly active. And from his first day, listening to the terrified, angry accounts of the returning crews, Wally Jenkins made the Gremlin his personal enemy. His world was the base's maintenance hangar, a cavernous, drafty building that smelled of high-octane fuel, sweat, and ozone. While officers debated strategy, Jenkins presided over a kingdom of greasy parts and complex schematics. The Gremlin became his obsession. He started a meticulous, almost forensic investigation. He noticed a pattern, not in the components, but in the routing. A main power feeder cable was run along the main wing spar, right through a section that housed the engine mounts. At one specific point, it passed within a fraction of an inch of a bare, unpainted, structural bolt. In the calm of the hangar, there was no contact. It was perfectly safe. But Jenkins began to imagine the scene during takeoff. The 4 1,200 horsepower engines, each a contained earthquake, shaking the entire airframe. In that storm of vibration, what if the main power cable began to whip? What if its insulated covering flexed just enough for the bare copper wire inside to touch that grounded engine mount bolt? It would be an instantaneous, dead short to ground. The entire electrical system would collapse. And then, as the vibration pattern shifted, the cable would whip back, breaking contact. Power would restore. It was a theory that sounded insane. To the engineers at Wright Field, it would sound like voodoo. But Jenkins knew he had to prove it. Proving his theory required a gamble that would have given any commanding officer a heart attack. Jenkins needed to replicate the fault on the ground. He selected a B-17 that had been particularly prone to the blackouts. With the permission of a skeptical but desperate flight commander, Jenkins and his crew prepared for a dangerous experiment. They towed the bomber to a remote, disused section of the runway. They chalked its wheels and tied its tail to a ground anchor. Jenkins's plan was to run all 4 engines to take off power simultaneously. The risk was immense. If the short circuit happened and caused a fire, they could destroy the aircraft and kill everyone nearby. Jenkins positioned himself in the radio compartment, right near the suspected fault point. The order was given. The engines coughed into life, their deep-throated roar building into a deafening, skull-shaking cacophony. The entire airframe began to tremble. They held the power for a minute. Nothing. Jenkins's heart sank. Had he been wrong? He was about to call off the test when he decided on one last, reckless act. He signaled the cockpit to momentarily reduce power and then slammed the throttles forward to full military power in a violent, abrupt surge. The engines screamed. The vibration intensified into a jarring, violent shudder. Jenkins kept his eyes locked on the cable. And then he saw it. For a split second, a brilliant, blinding blue-white arc of electricity flashed where the cable passed the engine mount bolt. A sharp crack was audible even over the engine noise. Simultaneously, the mechanic in the cockpit yelled, "We've lost it. Complete electrical failure." Jenkins stared, his theory confirmed in a terrifying flash of light. The gremlin was real. He had not only found it, he had looked it in the eye. Now, he had to kill it. Armed with definitive proof, Sergeant Jenkins prepared his report. It was not a formal, typed document from an officer, but a grease-smudged, handwritten account accompanied by a simple diagram drawn on graph paper. He detailed the exact location of the fault and the visual confirmation of the electrical arc. He presented it to his commanding officer, a major who had lost friends to near crashes and was willing to listen. The major was convinced, but he was a small cog in a vast military machine. The report went up the chain of command to the 8th Air Force headquarters. And there, it met a wall of institutional inertia. The response from the senior engineering officers was a masterpiece of bureaucratic dismissal. The design of the B-17, they argued, had been signed off by the best minds at Boeing. Thousands of these aircraft flew every day. A single, unverified observation from a sergeant, based on a dangerous, unauthorized ground test, did not constitute evidence of a systemic flaw. They suggested the problem was isolated to that one aircraft, blaming poor maintenance by Jenkins's own crew. They argued that rerouting a main power cable was a massive undertaking, requiring revised blueprints and thousands of man-hours, all for a fault that, in their view, caused exactly 0 confirmed losses. It was a classic case of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, while ignoring the terrifying reality that it was broke. Jenkins was ordered to cease his unsanctioned experiments. But the war did not care for bureaucracy. The near misses continued. At a base in Norfolk, a B-17 veered off the runway during a blackout, shearing off its landing gear. The crew survived, but the incident was officially attributed to pilot error. Jenkins heard about it through the mechanic's grapevine. It was the gremlin's first confirmed kill, and it was covered up by paperwork. He decided to go around the chain of command. The incident that finally broke the bureaucratic dam occurred not at Jenkins's base, but at another 8th Air Force station. On a crisp morning, a B-17F named Worry Bird was leading a group's formation on a maximum effort mission. The aircraft was heavy, loaded with fuel and a full bomb load. As it reached the critical point of its takeoff roll, the gremlin struck. The electrical system died. The pilot, Captain John "Jack" Roberts, and his co-pilot were suddenly flying blind. The plane, deprived of its artificial horizon and directional gyro, began a slow, insidious roll to the left. With the runway ending and trees looming, Roberts fought the controls by instinct alone. But without instruments, his sense of balance was deceived. He was in a graveyard spiral, just feet above the ground. Behind him, 24 other B-17s were in various stages of their takeoff roll. A crash would be catastrophic, blocking the runway and likely causing a chain reaction disaster that would wipe out the mission before it began. By a sheer, miraculous act of instinct, Roberts caught the roll at the last second and managed to keep the aircraft airborne, muscling it into a shallow, wobbly climb. Power returned after 3 seconds, but the damage was done. They were off course, low, and alone. They aborted the mission, jettisoned its bombs into the channel, and limped back to base. The near collision on takeoff had been witnessed by the entire control tower and the following bombers. This time, the cause could not be buried. Captain Roberts, a respected and decorated pilot, was livid. In his debriefing, he didn't blame the enemy, he blamed the electrical failure. He stood before his group commander and gave a blistering account of the blackout, describing it in the same detail that Jenkins had documented. A staff officer, who had heard rumors of Jenkins' bulletins, made the connection. The report, now bearing the weight of a combat loss and a decorated pilot's testimony, shot up to 8th Air Force headquarters with a new, urgent cover sheet. The phrase, previously identified systemic fault, was used. The engineering officers who had dismissed Jenkins were now on the defensive. A formal inquiry was ordered. Jenkins was summoned to headquarters to present his findings. The inquiry room was filled with officers whose rank insignia glittered. Jenkins stood before them, his sergeant's stripes feeling insignificant. But he was not the same man who had submitted the first report. He was now a field expert, backed by the silent consensus of crew chiefs across East Anglia. He presented his evidence calmly, his original diagram, the logs of the near misses, the testimony from Worry Bird, and the simple, undeniable logic of his fix. He had even brought a section of the power cable and a sample of the rubber grommet. He held it up. "This, sirs," he said, his voice steady, "costs less than a penny. It takes one man 10 minutes to install. And according to the reports from the squadrons that have implemented the field fix, it has a 100% success rate." The senior engineers argued back, presenting complex load-bearing calculations that proved the cable should not make contact. Jenkins listened patiently. When they finished, he asked one simple question. "With all due respect, sirs, have you ever been in AB 17 at full war emergency power on a cold morning?" The room fell silent. The theoretical world of blueprints had collided with the gritty reality of combat aviation. The officers who had seen their friends nearly die outvoted the engineers. The decision was made. A high-priority technical order was drafted and transmitted to every 8th Air Force base. It was not a complex redesign. It was Jenkins' fix. The order mandated the inspection of the main power feeder cable at the number 2 engine mount on every B-17. Where or close proximity was found, crews were to install a specified rubber grommet to provide a guaranteed insulating barrier. The effect was immediate and profound. The gremlin vanished. The true impact of the technical order was not measured in the absence of crashes, but in the silent, cumulative preservation of force. Before Jenkins' fix, the gremlin had been imposing a hidden tax on the 8th Air Force. It was eroding morale and randomly removing bombers from the order of battle before they even reached the enemy. Consider the math: if the gremlin caused even one bomber in 50 to abort its mission due to damage or trauma from a near crash, that was 2% of the force neutralized by a friendly flaw. On a 500-bomber raid, that was 10 aircraft, 100 highly trained airmen, lost before crossing the English Channel. Over the months it took to identify and fix the problem, this hidden attrition was substantial. But now, with the fix applied across the entire command, that attrition ceased. The effect was like giving the 8th Air Force a blood transfusion. The number of bombers successfully forming up and proceeding to target increased. The loss rates, when calculated against the number of bombers that reached enemy territory, began to show a slight but statistically significant improvement. Operational researchers noted the change but attributed it to better training. They had no Category 4, saved from self-destruction. The salvation was invisible in the broad statistics, but profoundly real on the flight line. The fix also had a second-order effect on crew confidence. Pilots no longer had to wrestle with a latent fear of their own aircraft during the most dangerous phase of flight. This slight edge in confidence, multiplied across thousands of crews, translated into better formation discipline and a higher chance of survival. Furthermore, the bombers that were saved from crashing on takeoff went on to fly not just one, but many more missions. By preventing the loss of just one aircraft, Jenkins' fix was preserving hundreds of future sorties and the lives of the 10 men aboard for dozens of missions to come. The story of the gremlin and its fix did not end with the B-17. The technical order and the incident report found their way to the desks of engineers for other aircraft. The B-24 Liberator, with its own complex electrical system, was found to have a similar, though less frequent, issue with wiring chafing against airframe components under high vibration. A preemptive inspection and modification program was initiated, likely preventing its own series of incidents. More importantly, the philosophy of design changed. The Jenkins principle, that vibration and wiring were mortal enemies, was incorporated into new aircraft designs. Wiring was given more clearance, better clamping, and improved insulation from the start. A lesson written in the near loss of Worry Bird was now being baked into the blueprints of the next generation of aircraft. For the ground crews, Jenkins became a folk hero. He represented the power of the enlisted man's practical knowledge over the theoretical knowledge of the officer corps. His story was told and retold, encouraging other sergeants and crew chiefs to trust their instincts and pursue fixes for other, minor, problems that the higher-ups ignored. This led to a wave of small but critical field modifications across the 8th Air Force, improved gun sights, better heating in the waist positions, that collectively saved lives and improved effectiveness. The war effort was advanced not just by grand strategy, but by 10,000 small acts of ingenuity from the bottom up. The American soldier, armed with the right knowledge and a stubborn refusal to accept good enough, had proven that the smallest detail could have strategic consequences. To understand the scale of what was saved, one must consider the brutal economics of the bomber offensive. The 8th Air Force suffered over 47,000 casualties. In this context, the loss of even a few dozen aircraft to a design flaw was a catastrophe. Historians later estimated that the Gremlin, if left unfixed, could have been responsible for the loss of 50 to 100 B-17s through direct crashes, mission aborts leading to easy enemy kills, and the cumulative drain on resources. Let us take the conservative number, 50 aircraft. 50 B-17s represented 500 airmen. It represented the explosive power of 1,250 tons of bombs that would never fall on German factories. It represented the industrial output of a city, all wasted. By identifying and eliminating the Gremlin, Jenkins and the crew chiefs effectively added the equivalent of 5 full squadrons back to the Allied order of battle. These were not new planes, these were veteran aircraft with experienced crews. The impact of those 50 saved bombers rippled through the war economy. It meant that replacement aircraft could be sent to other units. It meant that the German war machine felt the pressure of 1,250 more tons of bombs. It meant that 500 more American families did not receive a telegram beginning with, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." And this is a conservative estimate. The true number is likely far higher. How many missions were completed because a bomber didn't abort? How many German fighters were shot down by gunners on a plane that didn't crash on takeoff? The chain of causality is infinite. The wrong wiring fix was, in reality, a strategic victory. When the war ended in 1945, the maintenance hangars fell silent. The men who had built and fixed the bombers returned to their lives, unnoticed and mostly forgotten. Among them was Technical Sergeant Walter "Wally" Jenkins. He clocked out one last time. There was no ceremony, no photograph. His final paycheck was folded neatly inside a brown envelope. He walked home and hung his gloves by the door. The war was over. His work, as far as anyone knew, was done. For a while, even the engineers who had studied his method seemed to move on. But the legacy of his fix endured. The principles of vibration analysis and proper wiring routing became standard in aviation. Every modern aircraft that flies, with its miles of perfectly bundled and insulated wiring, carries the ghost of Sergeant Jenkins' discovery. The story of the wrong wiring fix is a testament to the power of collective, anonymous effort. It was a triumph of system over individual, of process over inspiration. After the war, the secret of the Gremlin was kept. The participants remained silent. This silence was a final, crucial act of their service. The heroes of the maintenance crews returned to civilian life, their war service a blank page. Their legacy is not just in the battles won, but in the very nature of modern aviation safety. The struggle to fix the Gremlin helped establish the rigorous standards that keep aircraft safe today. But for the men who lived it, the reward was simpler and more profound, the knowledge that in the darkest hours of the war, they had done something that mattered, something that saved countless lives, even if no one would ever know their names.